Penguin Random House Audio presents The Washington War, FDR's Inner Circle, and the Politics of Power That Won World War II, by James Lacey. Read for you by Ray Porter, with a preface read by the author. This audiobook includes a description of the Washington Warriors in a downloadable PDF. The Washington Warriors. This section is also available in the downloadable PDF, which comes with this audiobook. Henry Harley Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the driving force behind the creation of the great air armadas that bombed Germany and France into submission. His idea of getting things done was to tell someone to do it, and he ensured long-term success by making sure no one ever stayed around to disappoint him twice. Bernard Baruch, a self-made multi-millionaire, he had been the production czar during the mobilization for World War I and expected to get the call again. It never came. Roosevelt liked Baruch and valued his advice, but Hopkins, who saw him as a threat to his own power, always kept him at arm's length. Baruch spent most of the war offering valuable advice to whoever came calling. Alan Brooke, a British field marshal and chief of the Imperial General Staff. Brooke had three enemies during the war: Churchill, Marshall, and the Axis powers. His barely concealed disdain for the military capacity of the first two sometimes got in the way of defeating the third. William C. Bullitt, Jr. The most brilliant graduate of Yale's 1912 class, he wasted his talent on petty jealousies and revenge plots. He was the first U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, and at the start of the war the ambassador to France. He always judged himself as ready to play at the highest levels, and certainly saw himself as FDR's wartime Secretary of State, a job he coveted. James F. Jimmy Burns. For years he was the president's go-to man in the Senate. If there was something important to get through the Senate, FDR handed the job to Burns, whose technique, a combination of iron fist and velvet glove, shepherded through many difficult legislative proposals. In mid-war, he was brought to the White House, where he quickly established himself as the assistant president and took over running the country. Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister at the war's onset. Upon returning from the Munich talks with Hitler, he had famously promised peace in our time, to which Churchill retorted, "The government had a choice between shame and war. It chose shame. It will get war." Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister throughout most of the war. He was moody, argumentative, and often difficult to bear, and he drank too much, but in Britain's darkest hour, he was the indispensable man. Grenville Clark. As a confidant to presidents, Clark was the master of wielding power from behind the scenes, mobilizing both the Republican and Democratic establishments to an overriding cause, winning 2 world wars. Father Charles Coughlin, a bigoted, anti-Semitic priest who went from being an early Roosevelt supporter to railing against everything FDR stood for. His support of Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito finally caused the cancellation of his nationally syndicated radio show in 1939. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French and a thorn in both Churchill's and Roosevelt's sides throughout the war. Through arrogance and force of will, he played a weak military, political, and diplomatic hand with consummate skill. Thomas Dewey. As a district attorney in New York City and governor of New York State, he waged a relentless war against organized crime. But when he ran against FDR in 1944, he proved no match for the champ. John Dill. A British field marshal and former chief of the Imperial staff. After a falling out with Churchill, he was sent to the United States as a liaison to the American Joint Chiefs. He became a close friend to General Marshall and did yeoman's service explaining the Americans to the British and the British to the Americans. Ferdinand Eberstadt, co-vice chairman of the War Production Board, WPB, he almost single-handedly brought order out of chaos in the allocation of scarce raw materials. Unfortunately, he was a neophyte in the ways of Washington, a fatal weakness in the ensuing power struggles. Dwight Eisenhower. He began the war as General Marshall's chief planner and ended as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Felix Frankfurter, a Supreme Court justice and Roosevelt administration talent scout. His acolytes populated almost all the rungs of government just below the secretary level and were commonly referred to as Felix's happy hot dogs. John Nance Garner. As vice president for Roosevelt's first 2 terms, he famously observed that the vice presidency is not worth a bucket of warm spit. He really said warm piss. Leon Henderson, a man without friends or the desire to make any. When there was a dirty and unpopular job to be done, it went to the always bellicose Henderson. During the war, he was tasked with keeping inflation in check through the Office of Price Administration, where he accumulated enemies while almost single-handedly turning the tide of some of the most vicious Washington disputes. Sidney Hillman, a full-time labor leader, part-time communist, and the man Roosevelt kept on every production organization as a foil to the more belligerent labor titan John L. Lewis. Harry Hopkins. By living in the White House, Hopkins became Roosevelt's most powerful and trusted advisor. He was hugely capable, but just as hugely insecure and protective of his influence and position. Cordell Hull. As Secretary of State, he was rarely able to get beyond the Picayune and rise to the level of wartime consigliere, a role he coveted. Hull was the perfect secretary for a stable world, but was unable to cope with a world in crisis. Harold Ickes, the great curmudgeon and FDR's political attack dog. He hated Harry Hopkins and disliked everyone else. His inability to get along with anyone sidelined him during the great policy debates of the war, but Roosevelt kept Horrible Harold close as Secretary of the Interior and used him as a cudgel against his political opponents and enemies. William Bill Jeffers. He ran the Union Pacific Railroad through the time-tested methods of fear and physical intimidation, and did the same in Washington, where he was the rarest of things, a man who came to do a job. Rubber czar, accumulated the power necessary to do it, and then gave it up when the job was done. Jesse Jones, the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, and the Secretary of Commerce. If one needed money for a major project, Jones was the go-to guy. As he handed out money without regard to political affiliation, he was beloved by both parties. His feud with Vice President Wallace was the stuff of Washington legend. Joseph Kennedy. At the start of the war, he was ambassador to Great Britain, the Court of St. James's. Churchill thought him a traitor, and Roosevelt despised him, but he was kept around to help secure the Irish vote. Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, and Chief of Naval Operations for most of the war. He was roundly hated by nearly everyone with whom he came in contact, and even the amiable Eisenhower thought the war effort would significantly benefit if someone shot him. But he was the perfect man to kick the Navy out of its post-Pearl Harbor funk and drive the fleet toward his one burning ambition, the defeat of Japan. Frank Knox, a Republican who deserted his party for the higher cause of confronting Hitler. As Secretary of the Navy, he proved.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?